So we've got a ridge of high pressure building in from the west, quietening things down for the overnight period, but further rains gathering out towards the west, and that will move in across the far northwest of the UK as we head into the overnight period. Elsewhere though, showers will tend to ease through the evening. We'll see lots of clear weather, turning quite misty though, with some fog patches across parts of Wales and the southwest of England during the early hours. Following on from that rain band, we'll see showers turning quite blustery there towards the far northwest by the morning. Quite a mild night, temperatures down to 4 or 5 degrees across rural parts of Scotland, but elsewhere holding up in the high single figures. As for Monday, well, outbreaks of rain continue their journey southeastwards across England and Wales, weakening all the while, so giving some patchy rain across the far southeast into the afternoon. Elsewhere, it's a day of sunshine with a few showers around, those showers quite blustery towards the north and west of Scotland. But once again, it's a mild day for the time of year. Temperatures mostly in double figures, 9 or 10 degrees at best in the north, up to 13 or 14 Celsius down towards the southeast. As for Tuesday, well, further wet and windy weather will move in across the northwest of the UK. Towards the south and east, though, it's a quieter picture, a bit breezy, but plenty of sunshine around and staying quite mild for the time of year. Outbreaks of rain move their way southeastwards later on Tuesday, and it then stays quite unsettled on Wednesday and Thursday, but turning colder towards the north later.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
Questions to be answered, and there seemed to be a significant amount, does once again point its way to a public inquiry into exactly what happened in this case. Starmer's called for that. Would you call for that too?
I certainly think that first of all, there's one thing that's happening now. The NHS have to order an independent inquiry. That's been done. So they've got to look at all the whys and wherefores of what happened with this man. If it appears that we're not getting sufficient depth and breadth to this, then I think having an inquiry with all the powers that brings would be extremely advantageous. What I don't want is some long-winded inquiry that will take years, by which time other people will have been put at risk and maybe other lives have lost. We know what the problems are here, Camilla. Law's been passed on this. This is all about making sure on the ground we implement the highest degree of monitoring in order to ensure the safety of the public.
Has care in the community failed? I mean, it seems oxymoronic to say that it's care in the community in this case. We know that the number of psychiatric care beds has been slashed from 52,000 back in 2001 to 24,000 now. I've anecdotally, because I wrote my column about this in the Telegraph yesterday, received quite a lot of correspondence from people saying the situation with care in the community is dire. People aren't being adequately monitored. Was it a mistake to close down all of those mental institutions?
I don't think we should go back to those days when we had those appalling institutions where we just lock people away and forget about them, and not just mental health people, but autistic people and disabled people. Horrific way to treat individuals, and you know I campaign on that a lot.
I know.
However, I think if we move into a more community-based approach, which can be really good for many, many people who are on the spectrum and on that scale of mental health, we have to remember there will be a small but significant number who will continue to pose a danger.
Okay.
And that's why monitoring is so important.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon to you and welcome to GB News Sunday. Thanks for joining us this lunchtime. I'm Ben Leo, and for the next 2 hours I'll be keeping you company on TV, online and digital radio. Coming up this hour, Sir Keir Starmer says Labour can deliver international security for decades while launching a dramatic slapdown of would-be US President Donald Trump. Sir Keir reassured European allies at the security conference in Germany that NATO would be in safe hands under his watch. But I'm asking, should the person who's odds-on favourite to be our next PM be taking pot shots at the Donald? Meanwhile, things are going from bad to worse for Rishi Sunak. As many as 100 Tory MPs are planning to stand down before the general election later this year. But even though the Tories look set for a crushing defeat, should these MPs stand and face the music rather than jumping ship? I've got my thoughts on that. And no way back. That's the message being reported today as palace insiders insist Prince Harry will not be allowed a temporary role as a working royal while the King undergoes cancer treatment. So was that the Duke's plan all along? And as ever, this show's nothing without you and your views. Let me know your thoughts on all of today's stories we'll be discussing. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.com. Especially, I'm really keen on this Prince Harry story. What a turn of events in just 24 hours. Friday, Prince Harry might be coming back into the royal fold. Today, Sunday morning, look at the headlines on the Sunday papers. No way back for Prince Harry, the palace issuing a staunch slapdown of his plans. We'll get stuck into that and more, but first, here's your news with Sophia.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 1. I'm Sophia Wenslett in the GB newsroom. First, to some breaking news. Sir Keir Starmer has told the Scottish Labour conference that the war in Gaza must stop now. The Labour leader brushed aside a pause in fighting, calling instead for a permanent ceasefire. He also said that even the most terrible circumstances, a two-state solution must be back on the table. We'll bring you more as we get it. The White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in the US Congress for Russia's capture of a Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka early yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. US President Joe Biden warned last week that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see the city fall into Russian hands, as he pushed Republicans to urgently pass more military aid. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. Former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram told GB News Ukraine needs more support.
Loss of Avdiivka is significant. The Ukrainians have been holding on to that since 2014 and fighting the Russians. But they've made the sensible military decision not to sacrifice any more of their troops to keep this completely decimated piece of territory. The Russians are making some advances from a one-dimensional perspective on the front line, but these advances are tiny at the moment, and it's purely because Russia has got more ammunition from North Korea and from Iran, and the Ukrainians are suffering a shortage of ammunition coming from the West.
More than 400 people have been detained across 32 Russian cities since the death of Alexei Navalny on Friday. It's the biggest wave of unrest since September 2022, when more than 1,300 were arrested for protesting against forced military services. Part of President Putin's effort to cover heavy casualties endured in Ukraine. Russian state media, which is controlled by the government, has made no mention of the arrests or the many memorial services for Mr. Navalny. Meanwhile, authorities have been accused of doing everything they can to avoid handing over Mr. Navalny's body to his family. Yesterday, the 69-year-old mother of Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic visited the remote penal colony where he died. She says she was told his body had been taken to a nearby morgue, but when she arrived, she found it had been closed. Mr. Navalny's spokespeople claim his death was orchestrated by the Russian president. That's been rejected by the Kremlin. Political analyst and Russian exile Valery Morozov told GB News it looks like revenge.
It was a payback for Navalny. And the people who were behind, they've just decided that, Putin has enough support, about 70–80%. There is no problem, and just to get rid of Navalny, they've sent him from the prison, which was about 200 kilometers from Moscow to far north, and let him stay there and die.
And for the latest story, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Ben.
Thanks very much, Sophia. So it's not just Prince Harry making headlines this morning. Sir Keir Starmer is making waves as well, not least for comments he's made at the Scottish Labour conference in the last 30 minutes or so. He's again reiterated the call for a ceasefire in Gaza. He said, "I've just returned from the Munich Security Conference where every conversation I had came back to the situation in Israel and Gaza and the question of what we can do practically to deliver what we all want to see. An end to the killing of innocent Palestinians, a huge scaling up of humanitarian relief and an end to the fighting." Also, Sir Keir Starmer, he has been, well, I'd say criticised this morning, and in my opinion, slightly unwise, by saying Labour can deliver security for decades and is ready to make the difficult decisions over international security, which, as we delve into this, and I'll reveal in a second, was a barb at US President Donald Trump. Now, the Labour leaders used the security conference in Munich to assure NATO allies that he would seek to, quote, rebuild, renew and resource the NATO alliance rather than, quote, divide and threaten, in reference to Trump's warning that he wouldn't protect countries that fail to pay their bills. For now, joining me on this is political commentator Benedict Spence. Good afternoon, Benedict. Look, this comes off the back of David Lammy's comments a few months back where he called Donald Trump a sociopath or something akin to that. It's definitely going to rub him up the wrong way. Was Sir Keir right, bearing in mind it's likely these two faces, Trump and Starmer, are going to be in power probably within this year? Was Sir Keir right to be taking pot shots at Trump like this?
I actually think it's fine to take pot shots at Trump because Donald Trump takes pot shots at everybody. I think if there's one person who knows how the game works, it's Donald Trump. And I mean, we saw this with Boris Johnson. He was able to sort of launch the odd broadside against the Donald and take them back. And they ended up having a perfectly fine working relationship, as did Theresa May and Donald Trump for a while. He's somebody who I think, is more than happy to take and hand out insults. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of diplomacy, I think he's probably quite a straight shooter. The issue is, I think, more, in many ways, it's very easy to take pot shots at Donald Trump, especially if you're a left-wing politician. But actually, when you're talking about the NATO alliance and you're talking about the defense of Europe, it's a question of hard power. And the long and short of it is the United States has the vast military. It has military bases in Europe. It has nuclear weapons in Europe. Without the United States and its backing, actually, Europe is incredibly threadbare. And the questions by senior American politics, not just politicians, not just Donald Trump, but others, about other countries in NATO, their spending and their commitment to the alliance, I think are very justified, and they go down very well with American voters. So it's all very well Keir Starmer, taking aim at Donald Trump for his usual sort of bombastic rhetoric. But actually, is the Labour leader, whether whenever he becomes prime minister, is the UK actually going to be the person the nation that guarantees other countries' safety in Europe? The answer is probably not, given, as we know, the well-documented shortfalls of our own armed forces at the moment.
Yeah, so, I mean, David Lammy, who previously in recent months, he said that Donald Trump was a, quote, woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath. That was the exact quote. Today, Lammy is expected, he's, of course, the shadow foreign secretary, he's expected to say that he understands calls from the US for a more, quote, equitable sharing of the Western security burden. So is he taking a slightly different tack to Starmer there?
I think so. I mean, again, it's one of those things where, David Lammy, from the safety of opposition, says something about the next president. And if the president were to ever hear it, not that I think he probably knows who David Lammy is, he'd probably shrug and go, all right, let's slap that on a poster somewhere and it'll probably help my polling. I think, actually Keir Starmer has done quite well in the last couple of months at treading a very fine line diplomatically. And we see this in his attitude towards Benjamin Netanyahu. There's been lots of calls from the left of the Labour Party to denounce Israel, to call for a unilateral ceasefire much earlier on. Starmer recognises, I think, that he's the man that's going to have to be picking the phone to Bibi and to people like Donald Trump in the future, and he's going to have to be dealing with them one-on-one, and that he needs to avoid those kind of awkward conversations where, potentially there is a bit of bad blood. Now, I don't think Trump's going to mind too much, but I think we saw with the Netanyahu thing, Starmer is, I think, a lot hotter on this issue than a lot of other Labour backbenchers. And that's actually, in many ways, the sign of a good leader, of a good politician. Equally, though, I think that a shot across Donald Trump's bows at a Munich security conference is very well for signaling, but ultimately the future of Europe is going to have to be decided by whether or not Europe wants to pull up its own socks. And right now you see this in terms of how much money is being spent by Eastern European nations, Poland in particular, but also Finland, on their defences. And I think that that is where you will see the key differences, whether or not Donald Trump's words on the future of NATO have had any bearing.
Yeah. OK, Benedict, good stuff. My only concern is that, in my opinion, Donald Trump doesn't forget those kind of things. He's big on loyalty, hence why he's so friendly with Nigel Farage still. And actually, at a time when Joe Biden is perceived to be, less than friendly about the UK, I mean, he stubbed us a trade deal a few months back. I just think it's in our interest as a country to, not rub people up the wrong way, not least Donald Trump, who, arguably has quite a fragile ego. Benedict Spence, thanks so much for joining us this morning. And also, Trump did make some great points when he was in power. He said that, Germany wasn't paying their fair share of their NATO contributions at a time when they were still taking Russian gas. So he did have a point there. But let's see what my panel make of this today. I'm joined by political commentator Joe Phillips and former government advisor Claire Pearsall. Claire, let's start with you. Should Starmer have been a bit shrewder today instead of taking pot shots at, likely the next US president, especially a man, as I've just said, as Donald Trump, who's got a fairly fragile ego, to say the least?
Yeah, and you're quite right, Donald Trump does. And I don't think that if you're going to run around playing Prime Minister when you're not, you have to be really measured with the words that you use. Should Keir Starmer end up in number 10, he's going to have to work with Donald Trump, whether he likes it or not, because I think we can all see that that's where it's going with the American elections, and he should become president. So you can't just make these comments and expect them to not be listened to. And I think you're right that Donald Trump has a long memory. He will keep that in mind should should everything happen and you've got a Labour Prime Minister come the end of the year.
Joe, I mean, if someone had called me a woman-hating, neo-Nazi, sympathising sociopath, as David Lammy did about Donald Trump, I certainly wouldn't forget that.
No, but it's true. And I completely agree.
Lammy's right.
Yeah, I completely agree with David Lammy. I think Donald Trump is unfit to be President of the United States. And I think what Keir Starmer has said, particularly within, 48 hours of the death of Alexei Navalny, it's really important. We've got, bigger stories than Trump's ego. We've got Putin, who is undeniably responsible for Navalny's death. We've got Ukraine struggling. We've got a would-be president of America saying, yeah, bring it on. I'll tell whoever wants to attack Europe.
But isn't that just Donald Trump? That's his leadership style, isn't it?
Well, that's like saying...
I mean, he went around calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man, and he was the first president to meet a North Korean leader in the demilitarised zone. I mean, it worked. It worked.
But, that's an argument that is not fit for leadership in a serious time that we live in. That's like the bloke who's a sexist pig, who's vile, who's misogynist, who's racist, homophobic, and they go, oh, that's just Ben. We have to have sensible leaders. We live in very dangerous times. We need cautious, sensible people.
But I don't think that America has got a particularly great leader at the moment. You look at the problems you've got with Joe Biden.
Doesn't know what day of the week it is.
No, he doesn't. And I think there's some real health issues there, and I think that should be taken seriously. But what you had under Donald Trump, whether you loved him or loathed him, he's still produced on the promises that he set out to fulfil as president. So whether you like him or loathe him, he does stick to his word. He did go out there. He's met with people. He's met with presidents that no one else has. He had chats with Putin and King Jong-un. People like that. We may not see them as the great world leaders. However, they are there and they are powerful and they can't be ignored.
And he's certainly got a base. But can we steer it back to Keir Starmer this morning? So he's reiterated calls that he's backing a ceasefire in Gaza, which, of course, is going to put some distance between him and the Muslim Labour supporters. There's a website, themuslimvote.com, which is strategically trying to oust any ceasefire supporting Labour candidates. Is this going to be an issue for Sir Keir going forward?
Well, I think, unfortunately, for Sir Keir Starmer, who I don't doubt for 1 minute is a very decent man, but he seems to be incapable of making a decision or trusting his gut. We've just been talking about Donald Trump, who perhaps trusts his gut and his instinct far too quickly, and it's a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, the Labour Party has got itself in a terrible pickle because of calls for a ceasefire, which the Labour leaders, Keir Starmer, and the shadow cabinet have resisted up until now, because they've backed the same line as the government's line and most of the other European and Joe Biden's line, that a ceasefire is meaningless unless it's actually going to work. You've got to get negotiation, but you've got to get humanitarian aid. I mean, the truth is, Ben, that, Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't give a monkey's what Keir Starmer, Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, David Cameron or anybody else says. He will do what he wants to do.
I got a load of stick on Twitter this morning for yesterday asking, not getting bogged down in the details and the policy. I simply said on air yesterday that I was concerned about the number of kids in Palestine dying, and also in Israel. I view a life lost in Palestine as the same as a life lost in Israel. But the tribal response was really, I mean, at times quite vicious. What's going on there? Why can we not say quite genuinely and humanely, I'm worried about the number of people dying, especially kids in Palestine, without being attacked like that?
The toxic nature of this debate has gone too far, and I agree with you that it is appalling that we are seeing orphan children in Palestine, just the same way that you're seeing orphan children within Israel, and it shouldn't happen. Those are innocent citizens, and you can have sympathy for innocent civilians of Palestine whilst also accepting that Israel has a right to defend itself. But unfortunately, it's one of these arguments that has now become so polarised that one side believes themselves to be right and the other wrong, and vice versa. So I don't think it's helped by politicians wading in and taking sides and being present at marches. I don't think that is the point of politicians. I don't think they should do that. I think it's stoking up more division, which in this heated debate is needed.
Well, I agree with Claire. I mean, it has very long been the case that to attack Israel as a state or the Israeli government, whether it's Netanyahu or any of his predecessors, the automatic response from some sections is that you're anti-Semitic, which is clearly ridiculous. I am anti-Trump. It doesn't make me anti-America. And I think there are people who could equally, criticise this country with good reason or whatever. But I think Claire's absolutely right. The toxicity of the debate, and this goes right across many, many topics, and it's not helped by politicians like Suella Braverman, for instance, weighing in with the sort of inflammatory language that she's used, whether it's about civil servants or lawyers or immigrants, because it just continues to fester and it gives carte blanche to other people who might not be so thoughtful to actually then take things another stage further. OK, Joe and Claire, great stuff. Thanks very much. I mean, my issue with Sir Keir Starmer at the moment is that a couple of months back he went to Estonia and he was wearing that military jacket and meeting British troops and pretty much cosplaying the role of Prime Minister. And it seems, again, he's gone to this Munich security conference and he's kind of, acting as if he is the leader of Great Britain already, saying that I'm going to do this as PM and NATO will be fine, when actually, Sir Keir, you might be close, but you've not won the election yet, so hold your horses, my friend. Now, for all the best analysis and opinion on that story and more, go to the website gbnews.com and also catch us on our socials at GB News. You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo. Lots more coming up on today's show, including... and I love this. Gutless and cowardice. As many as 100 Tory MPs are planning to stand down before the general election later this year. But should these MPs stand and face the music rather than jumping ship? I know what I think on that, and I'll tell you after the break. All of that and more to come. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel. Stay with us.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Elon Musk has announced that the first patients to receive a groundbreaking brain implant from Neuralink is recovering well.
This is all a bit odd. The product, called telepathy, uses a robot to surgically place a computer chip in a region of the brain that controls movement.
Yes, Elon Musk says that the first goal is to enable people to control a phone or a computer just by thinking. He says that initial tests show promising signs of brain activity, meaning that patients with paralysis could one day overcome their conditions.
Not sure about this one. Joining us to discuss this breakthrough is applied futurist Tom Cheesewright. Tom, this sounds, well, slightly terrifying.
I certainly think a lot of people will be thinking this is something out of a sci-fi horror rather than reality. But this is a technology that's been a long time coming. We've been developing direct brain-computer interfaces for a long time, mostly for the sort of therapeutic reasons that are the initial goal, at least, of Elon Musk's Neuralink, to allow people who are perhaps quadriplegic to have direct control via their brains of initially a smartphone and maybe ultimately artificial limbs or a wheelchair.
It does seem fascinating how quickly this technology is moving on. I saw demonstrations perhaps a year or two ago of people playing a very simple Pong game just by thinking, moving sort of one line on a screen up and down. This seems like potentially there has been a breakthrough that means far more complex things can be controlled just by thinking.
Well, there's lots of different aspects to this technology. The initial attempts to interface with the brain used actually quite thick prongs almost that went into the brain, and they were quite solid, and so if the brain moved, they could potentially cause damage.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo, on your TV, online and digital radio. Some emails flying in about Sir Keir Starmer's comments. Well, it wasn't directed at Donald Trump specifically, but he was just referring to Trump's comments saying that, you know, he wouldn't defend NATO allies if they weren't paying up. So John says Starmer was wrong to make that remark against Trump. The day may well come when we beg Trump for support. And actually, that's a very good point. Do you consider yourself more allied with the US or the EU? Me, personally, I love America. If anything kicked off and it all came to it, I think I'd prefer to be looked after by America than anyone else. Maybe not Joe Biden specifically, but certainly the US state. Paul says, good luck to Trump. We could do more with leaders like the Donald. And Andy says, Trump is our only hope if we're to escape from the globalists. OK, Andy? Right, let's see what's been going on this side of the pond. Sir Keir Starmer will be absolutely jumping for joy at this news this morning. It looks like things are going to bad to worse from Rishi Sunak. It's been reported in the Sunday papers that as many as 100 Tory MPs are now planning to stand down before the general election later this year. I want to ask, even though the Tories are set for a crushing defeat, should these MPs stand and face the music rather than jumping ship? Let's see what my panel make of this. Claire Pearsall and Joe Phillips. I'm going to give you my opinion first of all, when you can react off the bat of that, Joe. I think these MPs, they stabbed Boris in the back. They knew what was going to happen inevitably, unless they're just totally void of any cognitive ability. I mean, how could you not foresee what was going to happen today by doing that? And now, when they know what's going to happen, they're going to lose their seats and they're going to be defeated in the most emphatic fashion. They want to jump ship before they even get a chance for the public to vote for them. They're gutless and cowardless. Do you agree or am I wrong?
Let's put Boris to one side for the moment. Let's not go down.
Do you hate him as well?
Yes,
I get the feeling you hate him as well.
I absolutely loathe him. I think he has done so much to destroy politics.
Let's not get stuck down
that.
So
let's not go down there. I think it is awful that people... I mean, I can understand why they're jumping. I mean, let's just take one step back, Ben. If you think about Mike Freer, for instance, who is standing down because of the death threats, because of the fear. we've seen on one of the front pages this morning about, protesters planning to attack the homes of MPs and leading politicians. So, I think one should, in the context of being serious, life as an MP, life as a local councillor or as a mayor can be pretty blooming tough. And it's not just you, it's on your family as well. And I think, whatever you think of politicians, most people go into politics for the right reasons. They don't go in it to line their pockets, and they don't go in it for glory. Now, things may change, but the reality is that it's really tough in opposition, and I think that's where the cowardice bit comes in. Because when you look at people like Harriet Harman, I know she's standing down the next election, but, Yvette Cooper, for instance, David Lammy, been around for donkey's years. Those people have been in power. They've also been in opposition. They've gone through the long, hard years of 14 years of Tory rule. And actually, if you go into politics, it's about public service, but it has to be a quid pro quo.
Well, you'd hope it is, but, I beg to differ with some... I'm not going to name names, but with some politicians, Claire, can I just read you a quote from, I think it's The Telegraph this morning. This is from one MP who's going to stand down before the election. They said, "I'm not going because I think I'm going to lose. I'm going because I'm worried I might win." They do not want to find themselves in a rump Tory party filled with, quote, the nutters who would be left after a big Labour win.
It's an interesting take on it. I sort of agree with Joe. There are many serious reasons as to why people are standing down. I spoke to an MP last week who said it was up to his constituents whether he lost his job or not, and he was going to stand and he would accept the will of the people. But on the other side of it, there are other people who have had so much abuse and intimidation that they don't want to go through that anymore. So I think it's very different. I think it depends where you are in the country. But I do think it's cowardly. If you are put there by the people, I think that you ought to be taken out by the people and put your ego to one side. And that's a very, very simplistic view on it, because the abuse that MPs are getting at the moment is like nothing I've ever seen. And I've been there for 20-odd years.
Yeah.
I have never known it as bad as it is.
So it's as worse as ever been, do you think?
Oh, absolutely is. There are personal threats against people on a daily basis, whether that be by phone, by email, in person, in the street. They are getting it.
And does that go back to your previous point from the other discussion about just tribalism and toxicity? Yes. I actually tweeted about this morning. Let me read you my tweet. I said, the problem these days is that people are so tribal. This is the tweet. Go and like it online if you want to pick it up. It says, problem these days is people are so tribal and nail their colours to the mast with complete disregard of nuance or critical thinking on both sides of the argument. It's why we're in the mess we're in now. Does that play a part in the...
Well, yes, and you've just read out some examples.
These emails.
Bring on the Trump or the Donald or whatever it is. There's no nuance, there's no consideration.
But people are allowed to support individual politicians.
Of course they are, and everybody is entitled to their opinion. But we also need to stop this toxicity because it is so dangerous. We can't, on the one hand, do the bleeding hearts and, oh, isn't that dreadful, how terribly sad that our children are doing terrible things online.
Yeah.
And at the same time, fuel this sort of language and hatred, which is why, I mentioned Suella Braverman, but, there are plenty of other people who are equally bad because they know it'll get a quick headline, it'll get a like on Twitter or whatever it's called these days. They'll get, held up as heroes or heroines by a certain type of person. But the people that they're talking to may not be as perhaps cautious.
Claire, what do we make of the calls for MPs to get more security? Sunak is said to be looking at it, isn't he? Was at least being urged to.
Yeah, and I think it's right. As we saw with Mike Freer's constituency office, I think that shouldn't be allowed to happen. There are protests now happening outside MPs' houses, and you've got a group, an eco group, that is threatening to protest at MPs' houses during the election campaign. Now, that can't be right. You shouldn't be able to go to somebody's personal property because you disagree with what they say. So I think that security always has to be looked at. It doesn't mean they're going to get an armed guard 24/7, but I think that there are some things that you can do to ensure the safety of MPs and their staff, some of whom work on their own in constituencies, and they shouldn't be put at risk.
Yeah, so it's staff, but it's also families. I know of an MP of long standing who said her daughter was terrified that mummy wasn't going to come home.
Yeah.
So when they see what happens to other people, you know, there are children there.
And I suppose it gives weight to the argument that 85k for an MP salary, perhaps, you know, on the surface sounds extortionate, but when they're dealing with that kind of nonsense on a regular basis, maybe it's not enough. Claire Pearsall, Joe Phillips, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Now, let's change gears before we move on. It's time for the Great British Giveaway. And this is your chance to win £18,000 in cash. Here's all the details you need for a chance to make that yours.
There's still time to become the winner of our Great British Giveaway. There's an incredible £18,000 in cash to be won. Totally tax-free cash that you could do whatever you like with. That's like having an extra £1,500 in your bank account each month for a whole year. It could go towards your mortgage or rent, buy monthly treats, or just send some of those day-to-day financial stresses packing. For another chance to win £18,000 in tax-free cash, text GBWIN to 84902. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message, or post your name and number to GB02 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrants must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 23rd of February. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Good luck.
Wow, not a bad prize, eh? That would certainly make your 2024. Bit miffed that I can't enter myself. You're watching, listening to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo. Plenty more to come up on today's show, including all the front pages. Prince Harry, no way back into the royal fold, despite his attempts on Friday to worm his way back into the royal family. But first, here's your news with Sophia.
Thank you, Ben. It's 1:30. I'm Sophia Wenslet in the GB newsroom. Sir Keir Starmer has told the Scottish Labour conference that the war in Gaza must stop now. The Labour leader brushed aside a pause in the fighting, calling instead for a permanent ceasefire. He also said that even the most terrible of circumstances, a two-state solution must be back on the table. The White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in the US Congress for Russia's capture of a Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka early yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. US President Joe Biden warned last week that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see the city fall into Russian hands. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. A violent riot erupted on the streets of The Hague last night after anti-government groups clashed with rival communities. What started as a peaceful Eritrean community meeting ended in violence, with police cars torched and objects thrown at officers. The Hague's mayor says an emergency order was issued and police presence has been increased. The King was seen smiling and waving as he attended church in Sandringham this morning. Braving the wet weather, His Majesty and the Queen clutched umbrellas in their first public outing since Prince Harry's interview on US television. The Duke of Sussex is said to be willing to undertake some royal duties while his father undergoes treatment for cancer, though there's reportedly been no changes to current arrangements. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thanks, Sophia. Remember, you guys at home can get in touch about all of the topics we've been discussing today by emailing me, gbviews@gbnews.com, or message me on our socials. We're at GB News. Lots more coming up on today's show, including no way back. That's the message being reported today as palace insiders insist Prince Harry will not be allowed a temporary role while the King undergoes cancer treatment. But could we see him back in the royal fold? I don't think so. The palace has been quite insistent this morning across all the front pages of the newspapers that definitely isn't happening. All of that and more to come. I'm Ben Leo. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World. Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, you know, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offending behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, you know, the odd tipple of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcomed by the royal family.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo, on your TV, online and on digital radio. Lots of you have been sending your thoughts in by email. One particularly, well, not just one, there's a few actually, for Joe Phillips, who's on our panel today. Joe, you made the point in the previous segment about everything being so toxic and tribal at the moment, yet you just sat there and said you loathed Boris Johnson, you hated Donald Trump, and you had some words about Suella Braverman as well. Aren't you a hypocrite?
No, I don't think I'm a hypocrite. I mean, it's a fair point to make. The point I was making about the toxicity was about people leaving Parliament and about the level of debate and discourse. I think Boris Johnson is partly responsible for that, actually, as it happens, because I think he brought politics and public office into disrepute, you know, way over.
But you loathe him?
I personally loathe him because I think he's damaged democracy.
So isn't that the same, though, with the same toxicity
that's not the same as
about?
saying go out and attack him, go and, you know, kill him, or he deserves to be hung up.
But my argument would be that some on your side of the left side of things would say, well, that's exactly the kind of language and rhetoric that encourages and promotes those kind of attacks.
I don't think that is... I don't think my language is particularly extreme. I think... And also, I'm sitting here, you can see my face. We don't know who those things are from.
All right, I just thought I'd put that to you because we've had a few emails and...
No, and it's absolutely, and it's a completely fair point. But there is something about anonymity.
Yeah.
You know, once upon a time, Claire will know this from working in the Commons for a long time, you'd get people turning up, they'd sit in the central lobby with a folder this thick, and it was on lined paper written in thick green ink and a lot of capital letters. That now has gone on to Twitter.
Now, Understood. OK, let's move on. One of my favourite stories of the day, actually the past couple of days, because it's no way back. That's the message being reported as Palace insiders insist Prince Harry will not be allowed a temporary role while the King undergoes cancer treatment. Now, despite Harry's brief return last week to the UK, Prince William, his brother, he's alleged to have told friends he's so angered by his brother's attacks on the monarchy, the list is endless, isn't it? There's no chance he'll be allowed back into the royal fold. Joining me now is royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams. Good afternoon, Richard. This is sensational, isn't it? Friday, we had all the murmurings from the Sussex camp that Prince Harry's going to worm his way back in and maybe do some temporary royal duties. Today, pretty much every front page is no way back for Harry. The palace haven't been shy in briefing journalists this morning, have they?
Well, no, but it was always completely impractical that anything like this would happen. I mean, all of this has come upon us, of course, very, very quickly. And initially, naturally, the transatlantic dash, then Harry came over after he heard of his father's cancer diagnosis. I mean, clearly that appeared, at least on the surface, to be that of a concerned son. And then the optics of this did look rather strange. It was only about half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, and instantly thereafter the King and Queen departed for Sandringham. He spent the night in a hotel and then went back to present an award in Las Vegas. And then we had the relaunch. It wasn't telling us anything new, though it didn't include Netflix, which I thought was extraordinary, of the Sussexes very controversially using royal titles and the arms and so forth, all of which raised a lot of eyebrows. And then subsequently, of course, Meghan getting a pretty lowly, quite frankly, podcast job. It's not Spotify, which was a $20 million contract. And subsequent to that, we had Harry on Good Morning America, not saying anything that would offend anyone, but nonetheless, again, the Sussexes with this link that they keep having to the media. And now we have this idea that apparently is being floated by Harry to friends, sources, the thought that he would return. He hasn't any patronages. This would make the royal family something of a circus which would revolve largely around the Sussexes every time they appeared. I mean, it's quite bizarre, really.
Richard, do you think the palace knew that Harry was going to do that interview with Breakfast TV and talk about his dad's health?
I don't think that the Sussexes have ever tipped the palace off in a long while on issues that, that involve them and the media. I think they've always taken the view, whatever their view on their own privacy, that the privacy of others is there to be invaded, quite frankly. You remember Oprah, you remember Harry and Meghan on Netflix, you remember Harry's memoir Spare, and they're the three worst examples. The point is, after you behave like that, you simply can't, at will, so to speak, offer your services at a time. Admittedly, the royal family is very stretched, but nonetheless, illness has struck, obviously, as we know, the King and also the Princess of Wales. But the idea that the Sussexes could suddenly reappear, I mean, it's outrageous.
How do you think Prince Harry's going to be feeling this morning, seeing these headlines?
I don't think he would have expected any other headline because, as you know, his life's work is supposedly to clean up what he sees as bad about the British media. But so far as the palace is concerned, I mean, their position is absolutely clear. The Sandringham agreement, which the late Queen, brokered, you can't have half-in, half-out royals, commercial part of the time, doing the odd patronages the rest of the time, and or the odd engagement. And if you did, who would get the publicity? They know perfectly well if they actually seriously thought that this was a possibility. I mean, you do wonder who advises them. I've wondered quite often, considering some of the contents of Harry's memoirs, some of the things included. They're completely unpredictable, and loose cannons are dangerous, as well we know.
Well, I think they advise themselves probably, Richard, because they've lost dozens of staff over the past couple of years, some who could only manage a couple of months with them. But look, for the sake of impartiality, they're not here to defend themselves. I guess Harry, as any son would do, flew to be beside his father's, to be with his father, rather, at a time when he just received quite potentially a concerning and devastating cancer diagnosis. So I guess you've got to give him credit for that. But I just wonder now whether Harry will use this snub from the palace and the King, and that's what it is. It's a snub, seemingly engineered by Prince William, to say, look, I made an attempt to heal the rifts of the past couple of years. I came out publicly, I said this is our opportunity to come together, and I was slapped down.
That is, in fact, you wonder, he might well believe that. But so far as saying it, I do think that the Sussexes must surely realise now is not the time, whatever they personally think, to criticise the royal family publicly. And that would be absolutely appalling.
OK, Richard Fitzwilliams, royal commentator, thanks very much. It's like the never-ending Sussex psychodrama, isn't it? It goes on and on. There's something new every day. And I know lots of you don't like hearing about Harry and Meghan, but they just keep delivering the goods. It's good fun, in my opinion. Lots more coming up on today's show, including Cornwall has become a hotspot for filming locations, but locals say they want more productions to reflect true Cornish culture. Our reporter's been there to see if Hollywood holds the key to saving that Cornish culture. I mean, what is that? I'd like to know. Cornish pasties, ice cream? I'm sure it's a bit more cultured than that. All of that and more to come. I'm Ben Leo, and you're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on this Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Lots of people very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East. Iran obviously denying it, but the next move from the United States, our key allies, will be absolutely key.
Absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of talk about where this could go, whether the situation could be escalated. But I think the chatter is heading in the right direction, which is about de-escalation. So if there are going to be targeted sanctions against Iran, that's already happened through expelling certain diplomats and other measures there. But you can do that without arm-to-arm combat at this stage. But I think the US will be weighing up all of its options. Antony Blinken obviously gave a press conference in the United States yesterday to say that, there will be a response from the US, but it'll be at their time and it'll be in the way in which they think is the most appropriate. So all eyes are now on the United States as to when it makes that move.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it, how domestic politics plays so much into international politics. The States, they've got a presidential election this year. We've got a budget coming up. So all the noise, both sides. You've got Donald Trump saying, go a bit more hawkish, I suppose you could say, than President Biden. And here we've got all the generals. We've got the Secretary of State for Defence coming out saying we need conscription, we need more cash. But a lot of that is part of the sort of national narratives rather than actually looking at what's happening in Iran, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it plays into, the very uncertain times that we're living. And you're absolutely right. There'll be supporters of Donald Trump who are clearly adversaries of Joe Biden to say we must act now. It's a demonstration of showing your strength. Opponents of Biden will say that the US looks weak if it doesn't take action now against Iran, who are clearly, as we know, funding these at arm's length organisations like Hezbollah in Tehran, like the Houthis who are carrying out the attacks in the Red Sea. So Iran is responsible.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo, on your TV, online and on digital radio. Doc Martin, Poldark and Jamaica Inn, they're all just some of the TV shows that are filmed and set in beautiful Cornwall. So it's easy to see why it's a popular destination with rolling coastlines and old-fashioned cottages. Don't forget the pasties and the ice cream as well. But some people are calling for TV programmes to reflect the actual Cornish lifestyle and language. Our South West reporter, Jeff Moody, has this report.
The tale of Ross Poldark, who returned to England in the 1700s after fighting in the American Revolution, has captured the imagination of millions, not just for its narrative, but for the swashbuckling image of Cornwall it presents. But Cornish MP Steve Double thinks this is only half the story.
Although we love to see Cornwall on the TV, all too often it feels like it's an advert for second homeowners, that it's that sort of picture postcard idealistic view of what life in Cornwall is like, when actually we have such a rich heritage, we have a real rich and diverse culture within Cornwall. Our history is full of great moments and really significant things where we have contributed to the UK and in fact the world, and I think we would just like to see more of that more accurately represented on the TV.
In 2014, the Cornish were granted national minority status under the Council of Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. They now have the same status as the UK's other Celtic people, the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish.
Since then, we've been kind of grappling with exactly what that means, and I think through this media bill, there was an opportunity to kind of just nudge the BBC to say, look, you really need to give regard to the identity of the Cornish that has been recognised by the government in your public service broadcast obligation. So it really was just sort of, if you like, laying down a bit of a challenge to the BBC to say, look, how are you representing the Cornish within your public service remit?
It's part of the media bill, currently wending its way through the Lords. The bill is updated regularly to keep in line with developments in broadcasting. Councillor Michael Bunny is from Mebion Kerno, a political party created to help win greater self-government for the Duchy. He thinks programming should reflect the Cornish language too.
People love Cornish place names, Cornish house names, you know, they're all around us. So I think recognition of the language, and I hope a real positive, inclusive celebration of it as part of our culture and part of our history and heritage. I actually think that's increasing, which is great. It's brilliant.
We il cafos ag an sueriol splan ag ymysg honeycomb crunch, praline caramel ag an wef, berry...
In 2016, the UK's first advert in Cornish hit our screens. But with only around 1,000 fluent speakers, it's unlikely we'll be seeing Cornish language programming anytime soon. The hope is, though, we'll be watching more shows portraying real life in Cornwall without a pasty or a cream tea in sight. Jeff Moody, GB News.
Well, Jeff Moody's had a great gig there, hasn't he? Going down to Cornwall, stuffing himself with pasties and ice cream, I suspect. Well, let's see what my panel make of this. Joe Phillips and Claire Pearsall. Claire, it always makes me laugh, and especially when, you know, in different languages, Welsh especially, you hear it a lot. They'll reel off in Welsh, and all of a sudden, in between, you'll get vanilla ice cream.
Yes.
You know, there's no word for certain...
Absolutely, and I think it's one thing to make sure that traditions are followed and the sort of beautiful nature of the land in Cornwall. Then, yeah, you want to see that represented. But you kind of think also, what is so different between that? Is that going to then anger their neighbours in Devon? Because there's already a bit of rivalry between the two counties anyway. And what about other counties and their rich heritage? You know, I'm all for an independent state of Kent. I think that would be, you know, the forefront.
Well, Liverpool's a big one.
Devolution.
The Scousers, Joe, they don't really see themselves as English, do they? They love this idea that they're their own separate state.
But I mean, I think it's nice. It's important. People, you know, if you have pride and affection for the place that you live or the place that you come from, wherever your roots are. But I think, you know, there's a slightly more serious issue here. You know, Cornish language, yes, I think that's great. And we're already used to many, many government documents being in English and Welsh, whether they're DVLA or various other organisations. We've already got the Alba channel, TV channel in Scotland in Gaelic. But this idea of... a less glamorised version on screen, I think is quite interesting, because if you look at something like Peaky Blinders and what it did for Birmingham...
and internationally.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I was in Istanbul a couple of weeks ago and a bloke said, "Are you from England?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, lovely jubbly. You know Peaky Blinders."
Yeah.
You know, and I sort of think, actually, it is true. There's other stuff going on. And there's been a lot of stuff on television from Wales, which is, you know, their police or hospital or other types of dramas, which show a different side instead of this sort of picture postcard.
So the Cornish language can be traced back 4,000 years and was considered dead as long ago as 1777. But it was officially recognised by the UK government in 2002 as a minority language. Do we need to be teaching Cornish in schools like they do Welsh? I mean, how many people actually speak Cornish?
I
think it's in the low 2000s, I saw earlier.
Yeah, it's not very many. Now, I don't see that there's any problem in teaching school kids some words about their county, some of the language. Do I think that we need huge investment into it? No, I probably don't, because it isn't going to be used widely outside of Cornwall and the sort of 1,000 or so people that do speak it. But there's nothing wrong with teaching kids. This is where the roots are. This is what your heritage is. And these are the words, for things for, cows and ice cream and roaming land or whatever it might be. Then, yeah, absolutely.
Dialect and language is so funny, isn't it? You get people who are quite up north compared to where I live. I live near Brighton. I'm not a Cockney by any means, but you speak to someone, I'll meet them on holiday and they'll say, oh, you're a Cockney, are you? Say, no, I'm not a Cockney at all.
How'd you get on with Michelle Dewberry?
Whole accent. I love her accent. I love the Irish accent as well.
And Irish, yeah.
Yeah, it's great stuff. Right, we'll leave it there. Enough Cornish, unless you've got any pasties or ice cream hidden under the desk for me.
I wish.
Moving on, you're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo. Lots more coming up on today's show, including Sir Keir Starmer. He's been, in my opinion, cosplaying PM again. He's been at the NATO conference, the security conference in Munich, saying that he would rebuff Donald Trump's claims that he wouldn't protect NATO if Russia attacked if they didn't pay up. But first, let's take a look at the weather with Marco.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, I'm Marco Pitagna. Here's your latest weather update from the Met Office. We hold on to unsettled weather across the UK over the next few days, all seeing some rain at times, but staying mild for the time being at least. This weather front's pushed outbreaks of rain away from the southeast of England during the course of the afternoon, so we've got a ridge of high pressure building in from the west, quietening things down for the overnight period, but further rains gathering out towards the west, and that will move in across the far northwest of the UK as we head into the overnight period. Elsewhere though, showers will tend to ease through the evening. We'll see lots of clear weather. Turning quite misty though, with some fog patches across parts of Wales and the southwest of England during the early hours. Following on from that rain band, we'll see showers turning quite blustery there towards the far northwest by the morning. Quite a mild night, temperatures down to 4 or 5 degrees across rural parts of Scotland, but elsewhere holding up in the high single figures. As for Monday, well, outbreaks of rain continue their journey southeastwards across England and Wales, weakening all the while, so giving some patchy rain across the far southeast into the afternoon. Elsewhere, it's a day of sunshine with a few showers around. Those showers quite blustery towards the north and west of Scotland. But once again, it's a mild day for the time of year. Temperatures mostly in double figures, 9 or 10 degrees at best in the north, up to 13 or 14 Celsius down towards the southeast. As for Tuesday, well, further wet and windy weather will move in across the northwest of the UK. Towards the south and east, though, it's a quieter picture, a bit breezy, but plenty of sunshine around and staying quite mild for the time of year. Outbreaks of rain move their way southeastwards later on Tuesday, and it then stays quite unsettled on Wednesday and Thursday, but turning colder towards the north later.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Thanks very much, Marco. Lots more coming up on today's show, including Rishi Sunak's called on British Conservatives to, quote, come together after 2 heavy election losses to Labour. So I'm asking, if he's onto something, should the right unite to stand up to Sir Keir Starmer and stop him getting the keys to number 10?
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
We have let Islamist extremism into Britain, we've let it fester, and now we've let it win. Our absolutely spineless surrender merchant political top brass are rolling over while government ministers wear stab vests and quit their jobs in fear. Veteran Tory Minister Mike Freer has had death threats from Islamists as well as an alleged arson attack on his office. The motive there has still not been established. He's standing down because he doesn't want to die. I cannot emphasise how important this is. A minister of the government is quitting his job because he doesn't want to be killed by a lunatic jihadi. And our Prime Minister has said absolutely nothing. Nothing. A spokesman for Rishi Sunak said he was saddened. Is that it? Our Prime Minister should have been out on the steps of Downing Street saying that we will not be intimidated. We will not let this continue. Enough is enough. What does he do instead? He tweets about XL bullies. Yeah, fantastic. Where's Keir Starmer on this? Well, he's conducting focus groups on how to get the Muslim vote back, so he's hardly going to come out all guns blazing, is he? Ed Davey? Well, there's no way a Liberal Democrat leader would come out and admit that his ideology has helped turn Britain into a poster nation for multicultural failure. The police have let protesters, which include rabid anti-Semites, rampage around London every flipping Saturday for the last 3 months. And today, they are finally saying that they don't support some of the protests, which in the past have included a now banned terror group and people holding up anti-Jewish signs. They're saying, please don't march down Whitehall. All right, but will you do anything to stop them if they ignore you? I doubt it. I honestly cannot believe that we have sunk to the level where a serving minister stands down because of threats from extremists and our Prime Minister just doesn't feel the need to address it.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon to you. Welcome to GB News Sunday. Thanks for joining us this lunchtime. I'm Ben Leo, and for the next hour, I'll be keeping you company on TV, online and digital radio. Coming up this hour, Rishi Sunak's called on British Conservatives to, quote, come together after 2 heavy by-election losses to Labour. So he's asking the Tories and Reform to join forces to stop Starmer getting the keys to number 10. I'm asking if he's onto something. Should the right unite to fight Labour? Then, human rights campaigners have claimed officers from Russia's intelligence service visited the prison where Alexei Navalny was held 2 days before his death. Is this more evidence that Putin gave the order to silence his political adversary? And it's been reported that the former presenter Philip Schofield paid his ex-lover a 6-figure sum in a non-disclosure agreement, preventing them from both discussing their relationship. Yeah, really interesting story about Schofield from the Mail of Sunday today. We'll cover that a bit later on. But of course, this show's nothing without you and your views. Let me know your thoughts on all of today's stories. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.com, or message me on our socials. We're on @GBNews. But first, here's your news with Sam.
Ben, thank you very much. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's just gone 2 o'clock and we start this hour with the news that we've heard in the last 60 minutes or so, that Sir Keir Starmer has now called for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. That was during a speech at the Scottish Labour conference taking place in Glasgow. It's a change to his previous stance for a pause in the fighting, saying now instead that the war must stop.
An end to the fighting, not just now, not just for a pause, but permanently. A ceasefire that lasts, conference, that is what must happen now. The fighting must stop now.
In the US, the White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in Congress for Russia's capture of another Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka earlier yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. Joe Biden has been warning that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see that city fall into Russian hands, and he's been pushing Congress to agree to more military aid for Ukraine. The Russian president, though, has praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. Former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram told GB News earlier that Ukraine still needs more support.
Loss of Avdiivka is significant. The Ukrainians have been holding on to that since 2014 and fighting the Russians. But they've made the sensible military decision not to sacrifice any more of their troops to keep this completely decimated piece of territory. The Russians are making some advances from a one-dimensional perspective on the front line, but these advances are tiny at the moment, and it's purely because Russia has got more ammunition from North Korea and from Iran. And the Ukrainians are suffering a shortage of ammunition coming from the West.
More than 400 people have been detained across 32 Russian cities now since the death of Alexei Navalny on Friday. Russian state media has made no mention of the arrests or the many memorial services for Mr. Navalny taking place across the country. Meanwhile, in London, tributes are continuing to pour in the Russian embassy as people gather outside. You can see there, if you're watching on TV, of flowers being laid, messages being left, and many people watching on as they pay tributes for Alexei Navalny. Meanwhile, authorities have been accused of doing everything they can to avoid handing over Mr. Navalny's body to his family. Yesterday, the 69-year-old mother of Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic visited the remote penal colony in the Arctic where he died. She says that she was told his body had been taken to a nearby morgue, but when she arrived there, she found it closed. Mr. Navalny's team have also claimed his death was orchestrated by the Russian president. That's been rejected, though, by the Kremlin. Political analyst and Russian exile Valery Morozov told GB News it looks like revenge.
It was a payback for Navalny. And the people who were behind, they've just decided that, Putin has enough support, about 70–80%. There is no problem, and just to get rid of Navalny, they've sent him from the prison, which was about 200 kilometers from Moscow to far north, and let him stay there and die.
In other news, 2 ministers have written to police chiefs to express their concerns over the safety of politicians amid increased protests in recent weeks. Security Minister Tom Tugendhat and Policing Minister Chris Philp took the unusual step after pro-Palestinian activists gathered outside the home of Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP. They say the current laws allow for protesters to be directed away from residential areas, and they're encouraging police to make robust use of them, rather. And that comes as reports in the Daily Mail suggest that Just Stop Oil activists are planning to occupy the homes of various MPs, with one protester reportedly telling a journalist the group is ready to look a bit loony. And finally, the King was seen smiling and waving as he attended church in Sandringham this morning. Braving the wet weather in Norfolk, His Majesty and the Queen clutched umbrellas in their first public outing since Prince Harry's interview on US television. The Duke of Sussex is said to be willing to undertake some royal duties while his father undergoes treatment for cancer, though there's reportedly been no changes to the current arrangements. And for the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or of course go to our website, gbnews.com/alerts.
Thanks, Sam. Great stuff. Let's get stuck into our next topics. Rishi Sunak, he's called on British Conservatives to, quote, come together after 2 heavy by-election losses to Labour. He wrote in the Daily Telegraph on Friday, that the right of the British Conservatives should unite to defeat Starmer. Sunak says the circumstances facing the Tories are challenging, and that always makes me laugh. I mean, what an understatement. They're challenging, but he insists Labour doesn't have a plan.
Midterm by-elections are always difficult for incumbent governments, and the circumstances of these by-elections were, of course, particularly challenging. Now, I think if you look at the results, very low turnout, and it shows that we've got work to do to show people that we are delivering on their priorities, and that's what I'm absolutely determined to do, but also shows that there isn't a huge amount of enthusiasm for the alternative in Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, and that's because they don't have a plan. And if you don't have a plan, you can't deliver real change. And when the general election comes, that's the message I'll be making to the country. Stick with our plan, because it is starting to deliver the change that the country wants and needs.
OK, joining me now is political commentator Benedict Spence. Benedict, Richard Tice also wrote in the Telegraph on Friday saying that absolutely no chance of Reform standing down like they did in 2019 as the Brexit Party, and they pretty much handed the keys to number 10. Sunak's barking up the wrong tree, isn't he?
He is, although it is rather complicated, and it's sort of rather amusing when we hear Reform figures talking about this, because I think We'll start off with the Conservatives, and that is that I think Rishi Sunak is right when he says that Labour doesn't have a plan. But the problem there is that Labour doesn't need to have a plan. It is no secret to anybody that actually Labour keeps on U-turning on things and isn't quite sure where it stands. And yet it is polling significantly better than the Conservatives. And that must be terrifying for Rishi Sunak, because it shows that even though he does have a plan, he has several plans that he's thrown at the wall in a desperate bid for them to stick. People don't trust the Conservatives with a plan. They'd rather trust Labour with no plan than the Conservatives with one, because the track record of the Conservatives in the last few years is not to deliver very many things that the average Conservative voter deems very important. And we saw this with the by-election turnout. A lot of people did not simply switch to Reform. They just straight up didn't turn out to vote for the Conservatives. And that's even as the Tories are coming out with suggestions that they'll cut a tax here and they'll fight woke stuff in the army there. That's the problem, actually, and they're really struggling to enthuse people. But when it comes to the idea of Reform potentially playing kingmakers, I thought they've been polling at around 10% for quite some time now at a national level, and they got 10 and 13% in these last two by-elections. They got 13% in the particular by-election where the former Tory was deeply unliked, and the person that they chose to replace him was his partner. They need to be doing better, actually, if they're going to be taking votes off the Tories. I think they're doing a respectable business. They're doing respectably, but they're not doing fantastically well. The major concern for the Tories is not right now votes going to Reform. It's simply Conservatives going, yeah, I hear what you say, but I straight up don't trust you.
Well, it appears like they're not going to Labour either. In Wellingborough, they had 107 more votes than they did in 2019. But Benedict, let me ask you about this developing story this morning from Keir Starmer calling for a ceasefire, finally, in Israel. What's that going to do for his election prospects?
Nothing. It'll do absolutely nothing. This is a complete charade, because nobody actually believes that he feels sort of wholeheartedly in favour of the Palestinian cause. The left of his party dislikes him and would dislike him whatever happened. All that's happening now is that he's calling for a ceasefire that they know he doesn't believe in 4 months after they initially started demanding that he do so. It's not going to massively change his appeal, because also a lot of Muslim voters who say that they won't vote for him anymore won't forget this. They're not idiots. They're not going to forget that for a very long time he didn't move on this. But in most of those constituencies, he's going to win the majority of votes anyway. So I don't really think that this changes very much. I think it allows him to be a little bit more dexterous, if you like, especially with the upcoming Rochdale by-election, so as to avoid perhaps an embarrassingly close margin. But ultimately, I don't think it changes much for his electoral prospects, because simply a lot of these voters who feel very strongly about Israel-Palestine, they might not be very happy with Keir Starmer, but they ain't going to go to the Tories and they ain't going to go to Reform. So who does that really leave them with? And the Greens and the Lib Dems aren't doing well enough in those seats for it to make a massive difference. So I think it's one of those little sort of signalling exercise to say, well, I've waited this far, I've been very magnanimous, very patient, but enough is enough. And that shows on the world stage that he is a very cautious future statesman. In terms of his electoral prospects, I don't think it changes very much at all.
OK, political commentator Benedict Spence, thanks very much. Let's get the thoughts of our panel now. Joe Phillips, political commentator, and Claire Pearsall. Claire, Sir Keir has said this morning that he warned Benjamin Netanyahu, quote, not to extend Israel's military offensive to Rafah, as he stressed the need for a two-state solution. Do you agree with Benedict that it's not going to really do much for his electoral hopes?
Yeah, I mean, I think Benedict was right. It isn't going to do much at all, because it is too late. You can't have your party calling for something and then 4 months later decide that you might like to do that. He feels that he needs to fill the void and get some headlines out there. And I think that's about it. And I think for once, the British government, Rishi Sunak's government, has done the right thing by just being consistent and being in the background, offering support where they can. Lord Cameron going out onto the international stage. I think that that is the best thing you can do, because whatever Keir Starmer says, I don't think anybody's going to listen to within his own party, let alone Israel or Gaza. And the Prime Minister, but just sitting back and saying, we are offering our support, we are offering to do whatever we can, but keeping out of the actual fighting itself, I think is the right thing to do.
Joe, this just gives more ammunition to Sir Keir's nickname of Sir Flip-Flop, doesn't it? He's just late to the party again.
He's very cautious. I think that is, his natural demeanour. He's a lawyer. You know, he wants to see the evidence. He's got a lot of people, as all leaders have, people talking in his ears with information from focus groups, polling groups, people who are trying to get up the greasy pole and all of that sort of stuff. And there's nothing wrong with being cautious. Sometimes cautious is better than knee-jerk. But he has had a very bumpy week. And they've been flip-flopping, you know, not least of all on the green energy investment plans, you know, because the simple thing is, actually, you didn't need to put a price on it. You just needed to say, we are committed to. But because you put a price tag on it, you then have to row back because you can't afford it, so it looks like you're rowing back from the whole thing. There are other issues that we've already spoken about. And I think on Gaza, Palestine, as Benedict said, it's not going to make a difference if there was a general election tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, although people care, and they care very deeply, and they may, you know, take a variety of stances.
But you just can't trust Starmer, can you? One year he wants Jeremy Corbyn in power, despite rubbing shoulders with Hamas. The next he's got a £28 billion green pledge that he bottles the next week. It goes on and on. He just U-turns. And, you know, you just want to know what he's about, really. Where's the substance?
Well, I think you could say the same about any politician in any country.
Not as bad as Sir Keir Starmer, surely.
Yes, you can, actually. I mean, you can look at the last 6 prime ministers we've had and tell me what promises any of them have kept.
Well, Liz Truss never had a chance. She was ousted before she had a chance to
But I think also in this debate, so it's all very well for Keir Starmer to say a ceasefire now, but he's not put any suggestions as to what would happen next. And you can't just say, let's have a ceasefire and then everything will be fine, because that plainly isn't going to happen.
He said to delegates in Glasgow this morning, any ceasefire cannot be one-sided. It must stop all acts of violence on both sides, and it must lead to a genuine peace process. But I guess the problem is you need Hamas, the death cult, the kid killers to come to the table and behave like normal people.
But it's also, you know, it's the aftermath. Who is going to rebuild Gaza? Where are all these people, these poor, destitute, homeless, starving people, women and children, going to go to? You know, who's going to look after them? Who's going to pay for it? Are you going to rebuild it? Is it going to be a two-state solution?
It needs to be a two-state solution. I think everyone's agreed across the political spectrum that it needs to be. I mean, everybody, Rishi Sunak, Joe Biden,
David
the lot. Yeah. Well, just briefly, what do you make of this call from Rishi? This made me laugh on Friday. Rishi Sunak calling for the right to unite. He never mentioned reform by name, but, I mean, that's what he meant.
Yeah, do you know what? I think he should just call for his own politicians to unite. A united Conservative Party would be a start. I don't think we need to add anybody else into the mix. Can the Parliamentary Party stop fighting each other, and then we might have a chance of winning this election? Because if they don't do that, then it's toast.
Richard Tice said that they're just definitely not going to do what the Brexit Party did and stand aside. The Tories are not to be trusted at their word.
Well, you know, there's nothing to show, actually. It's only supposition that people who voted Reform would have voted Conservative if Reform weren't standing. And I think, you know, the point that you made, Ben, is true, that although the Tories did really, really badly, the increase in the votes for Labour were actually quite minimal. So it's a swing against the Conservatives as opposed to...
And actually, Nigel Farage made this point previously, on this occasion with Reform and also previously with the likes of UK.
This is not a Reform election broadcast, is it? I mean, there are other parties involved.
Well, I mean, they're the third party now.
In some areas.
Lib Dems are finished.
Well, in some areas.
What, you think they're going to poll higher than Reform nationally?
I've got no idea. I mean, it depends when...
Where's Ed Davey? No one's seen Ed Davey for weeks since the post office. It's like, where's Wally? Where is he? Have you seen Ed Davey?
No, I haven't. And I think it's really interesting you bring that up, because the Lib Dems really haven't made any gains whatsoever. And you look at these 2 by-elections and they've been nowhere. No. Normally, they are out campaigning really hard. They haven't been. They seem to have sunk in the background. And I do think Reform are looking like they are going to be the third party.
Well, they might be in some places, but the point I'm making, you know, this is not a TV channel which is just for the voice of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice.
No, this is the first time I've mentioned Nigel on this. It's been an hour, 17 minutes. Well, he's a presenter on this channel. Yeah, my point was that there's a myth that Reform voters, as with UKIP, were just draining votes from the Conservatives, when in actual fact it was a lot of disillusioned Labour voters.
No, absolutely. And that was the point I was making. There's nothing to show that, you know, if Reform weren't standing, that those votes would go back to the Conservatives. So Rishi Sunak's call is a bit pointless, actually, and I think Claire's absolutely right. Unite. You've already got people going, oh, we need a new leader. That is the last thing the country needs. Never mind the Conservative Party. If they actually put the country first instead of themselves, then they might be in with a chance.
Well, I think a lot of people on the right of the argument would say that, you know, we need some proper conservatism in the Conservative Party and not Lib Dems in disguise. Not my thoughts, just repeating what you lovely viewers tell us. Now, for all the best analysis and opinion on that story and more, go to the website, gbnews.com. You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo. Lots more coming up on today's show, including human rights campaigners have claimed officers from Russia's intelligence service visited the prison where Alexei Navalny was held 2 days before his death. Is this more evidence that Putin gave the order to silence Navalny? All of that and more to come. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Welcome to the show. Superb stuff, great footage. So you're right in the thick of it there. What's the mood on the ground?
Well, I've left there now. I've actually now come to that EU Council summit that I was talking about. It's still pretty chaotic. The entire city of Brussels has been completely clogged with these tractors, sort of 3 abreast in most of the roads across the city. The people of Brussels aren't particularly happy. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent for some people of the Just Stop Oil protests, you know, people gluing themselves. People are unable to get to hospital appointments, and there's a lot of upset about the destruction that's happening on the streets of Brussels today. But on the other side, there's also the protests, which the farmers are saying that EU green laws simply are not able to fit with what they need to do to keep their businesses going. And just before the protests happened, we saw the European Commission actually make some concessions to the farmers' protests. And this is on the demands that were put on them to set aside somewhere in the region of 5% of their land for regrowing for biodiversity. A lot of the farmers have said that's not possible, and the European Commission has said that they can delay that coming in. So they have won a small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel, and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures. Endless red tape, as Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain. They've simply had enough, and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
Affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo, on TV, online and digital radio. Some emails flying in. Andrew says, good afternoon, Andrew. Sunak is correct. The right should unite. All Tories should stand down and allow reform a path to victory. Interesting idea. I think Tice did moot that a couple of weeks ago to the much humour from the Tory benches. Terry says, I'm warming to the idea of uniting the right. Whose idea is it exactly? Deals to ensure the survival of genuine Tories, coupled with reform parliamentary routes, certainly not a full-scale stand-down. Ian says, I've been a Tory voter and Tory member for over 40 years. I had a vote in the leadership election, which I voted for Liz Truss. I won't be voting again. There we go, and that's part of the problem, isn't it? Just complete disillusionment with the current state of, I guess, not just the Conservative Party, but politics in general. So, let's move on. Human rights campaigners, they've claimed officers from Russia's intelligence service visited the prison where Vladimir Putin rival Alexei Navalny was held 2 days before his death. The high-profile Putin critic died suddenly on Friday. In the days following, Navalny's mother has been able to recover his body, she said. Following his death, hundreds of people across Russia have been detained and blocked from laying flowers at memorial events. And the Kremlin, they say the West's reaction is unacceptable, describing it as absolutely rabid. Foreign Secretary Lord David Cameron said there will be consequences for Vladimir Putin. Joining me now is former head of counter-terrorism at the MOD, Major General Chip Chapman. Good afternoon, Chip. Is this case as clear-cut? Is this a direct Putin hit on Alexei Navalny, or is there more to it? Because one question I had is, why would Putin do this at a time when all it's going to result in is make the case for more aid for Ukraine?
Well, the body is the cause of the death, and that's not been released yet. But murder is the system in Russia. We saw that with Litvinenko, we saw it with Skripal, we saw it with Boris Nemtsov, who was the true opposition leader in 2015. I think Putin actually believes he's winning in Ukraine, so he doesn't really give two figs about that sort of stuff. But what the death does mark is the culmination of the Kremlin's effort to eliminate all sources of opposition. And don't forget, Navalny was barred from the 2018 election in the same way that Boris Nadzehdin has been barred from the 2022 election. He was the independent candidate. So this is really Putin consolidating his power. If you get in his way, he'll get rid of you. That's exactly what happened after Prigozhin had the coup or suspected mutiny last year.
And does this indeed increase the call for more funding for Ukraine? The Republican Party in the US are umming and ahhing about sending another, I think it's 90 million or billion, is it $1 billion? Yeah, another $90 billion, just insane amounts of money. Does this give the case more weight?
It's not a causal link, but there's the thing which is still evident is that Russia is a revanchist state which seeks to impose itself on Eastern Europe and to increase its sphere of influence. If you believe that theory of history, which I do, then support should be there anyway. The support from America, the $60 billion, is stuck in the House of Representatives at the moment. They're actually on recess at the moment till the end of February, so there isn't going to be that coming in the next couple of weeks. So the key thing is, what does it really mean for the future? Because we've got presidential elections on the 13th to 15th of March, where it is inevitable that Putin will win. We'll have Putin 5.0, and by the end of that, he'll have been in power longer than Stalin would have been in power. And in that time, his authoritarian leaders like him seem to entrench authoritarian institutions and practices, and that is why Navalny was got out of the way, not because he was important politically, but he was important in the marketplace of ideas. That's why actually Navalny will live on, because one of the things he understood was the power of social media and YouTube. So exactly why 6 months ago he did a YouTube video which said that even though he might die, he would not die because those ideas will live on. He really campaigned on anti-corruption because the ideas of sort of human rights and democracy are not really that well developed in Russia. But they will live on because that was something which had emotional resonance with the people in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, you've really got to give it to Navalny, regardless of what you think of him. I mean, going back into Russia, despite knowing that the threat that was hanging over his head, all for the sake of, you know, standing by his country, it's got to be admired. But former head of counter-terrorism at the MOD, Major General Chip Chapman, thanks very much. Let's see what my panel make of this now. Joe, let me just come to you. Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, he called Putin a corrupt thug in the wake of this Navalny news. But some people have said that he has also jailed a Ukrainian-Russian journalist who's been critical of the Ukrainian government, and he's been languishing in a cell for 400 days. And they're kind of asking, what's the difference? I know he's not poisoned him, but what's the difference between them?
I think there's a considerable difference, isn't there? I mean, I think, you know, there are questions, and one of the reasons that Ukraine was not allowed to join NATO and the EU was because of it hadn't been seen to address corruption. And there is no doubt he's just got rid of his former chief of the army and replaced him with somebody else. But to go back to Zelensky, Navalny. I think, you know, we've been talking a lot today about politics, about threats to politicians, about toxic cultures, about MPs leaving sinking ships. I think, and we've had people saying, I'm not going to vote for anybody because they're all the same. I think this is a reminder, and it should be a stark reminder to all of us, that we are so fortunate in this country to have democracy. And people like Navalny, who has now left his children fatherless, his wife is a widow.
Yeah, it's very sad.
It's beyond sad. It's people who have got principles. And he knew, as you said, he knew when he went back to Russia, he was probably going to be murdered. He wouldn't have necessarily been safe if he'd stayed in the West. There would have been another
Well, he was poisoned in, I think it was Berlin some years ago with Novichok, and he miraculously survived.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think, you know, it doesn't do any of us any harm just for a minute to stop and think, and actually think, this is what Ukraine is fighting. They're fighting Putin. So people who are wobbling, and of course it's a huge amount of money, but they're getting ever closer.
But Claire, the concern is, where does this endless pit of taxpayer money end, especially when we've got our own problems in the West?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question, because I think you always have to look to support countries like Ukraine who are fighting oppression against somebody that just wants to go in and take their land. Now, we wouldn't accept that in this country, and we would expect allies to come to our assistance should somebody decide that they want to take, a part of the United Kingdom as their own. So I think it's imperative that we continue supporting the Ukrainians and supporting Zelensky himself in winning this war. But I do understand people's anger when you see the large amounts of money and the supply that are going over there, when you're also leaving British forces with less of the stuff that they would need to defend themselves should the worst happen in this country. So I get the argument, but I don't think that we can just back out. I think America need to step up perhaps a little bit more than they have done previously, and for the rest of Europe to get their act together and put in what is needed to make this war end, because it has to end. It's now 2 years on and it's still not anywhere near it.
Joe, what do you make of these? I mean, the main concern that we need to arm Ukraine and keep arming them is that once, if and when Putin takes Ukraine, he's just going to move further west, and it's going to be NATO countries next.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, we all stood by and didn't do anything when he took over Crimea in 2014, which gave him... I mean, the thing to remember about Putin is he plays a long game. He's patient because he's got nobody snapping at his heels. He's not having to, you know, do what Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer is to try and do the right thing to get elected. He can stay there for as long as he wants. So he can play a long game. He can be dangerous. He can stir up mischief by saying nice things about Joe Biden, you know, and casting...
Well, he said so. He said, of course, he wanted him to win the presidency.
Exactly.
I said to that, I mean, who wouldn't want Joe Biden to win the presidency when he's kind of, you know, doesn't know what day of the week it is? You know, who wouldn't want that as an adversary?
Well, precisely. So that's, you know, Putin's meddling, and we know that Russia has meddled in elections all over the world, and their influence is diabolical. But I think, you know, what do we do? What can we do? Ukraine is, you know, it is on the continent of Europe. And there is absolutely no doubt, Ben, that if Putin gets away with this, you know, where's next? Poland? Estonia? You know, it's
yeah,
it's
all right.
Scary. We live in scary times.
Indeed. Right, you're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo. Plenty more coming up on today's show. But first, here's the news with Sam.
Ben, thank you very much. Just gone 2:30. I'm Sam Francis. The headlines this hour. Sir Keir Starmer has now called for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza during a speech at the Scottish Labour conference. It's a change to his previous stance for a pause in the fighting, saying instead the war must stop now. But he said the ceasefire can't be one-sided, calling for the Hamas terror group to release all of its remaining hostages taken on October the 7th. And he's also said that even in the most terrible of circumstances, a two-state solution must be back on the table. In the US, the White House has blamed inaction by Republicans in Congress for Russia's capture of another Ukrainian city. Kyiv ordered the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka earlier yesterday, giving Moscow its first major gain since the fall of Bakhmut last year. Joe Biden had been warning that a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine could see that city fall into Russian hands, as he's been pushing Congress to agree to more military aid for Ukraine. The Russian president, though, has praised the city's capture, calling it an important victory. And 2 people, we understand, have now been charged by police and will appear in court after the pro-Palestinian demonstrations in central London yesterday. 34-year-old Lucia Whitaker Diabreu has been charged with failing to remove a face covering, and 48-year-old Martin Prady is accused of obstructing a police constable. That comes after tens of thousands of protesters marched through the Irish, the Scottish and the English capitals in major demonstrations against the Gaza war yesterday. 12 arrests were made in London for a string of alleged offences, including hate-related placards and some assaults on police officers. And the King was seen smiling and waving as he attended church in Sandringham this morning. He and the Queen braved the wet weather, clutching umbrellas in their first public outing since Prince Harry's interview on Good Morning America. The Duke of Sussex said he is said to be willing to undertake some royal duties while his father undergoes treatment for cancer, though there's reportedly been no changes to current arrangements. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Sam. Now, you can get in touch about all of the topics we've been discussing today. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.com, or message me on our socials @gbnews. Lots more coming up on today's show, including a total of, well, nearly 7 million, 6.9, foreign workers were operating in the UK last year. That's up by more than 400,000 over the past 12 months alone. And also, ministers are planning to scrap exams required to allow dentists from countries outside of Europe to work here. What could go wrong? I want to know if the government should be prioritising British workers. And let's not forget this big story from the Mail on Sunday today. Philip Schofield has signed a non-disclosure agreement with his ex-lover at ITV's this morning. More on that in just a short tick. I'm Ben Leo. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
Lots of people have different ideas, but principally a conservative approach to getting growth is to reduce taxes so that people, ordinary people and businesses can spend more of their own money to invest and grow the economy.
So the theory is that you cut taxes and that then pumps more money into the economy.
Exactly right. And then people, it's not government that are creating wealth. It's individuals, businessmen, companies that create wealth. It's the private sector that creates wealth, that the public sector then taxes and spends.
I get the theory, but one of the criticisms of you, and I think one of the criticisms actually of all political parties, is they appear to be incapable of cutting government spending.
That's the key. I mean, and I think when I look back, is that we should have had a credible plan to reduce the increase in spending. Now, that's often a difficult concept to explain.
But it's in line with inflation, etc.
That's all right. So when you're slowing the increase, it means, one year you spend £100 and the next year you spend maybe £101 as opposed to going up to £110. So the actual level isn't going down, but you're slowing the increase. And that's very much what I tried to do. And actually, looking back, the one thing I wish I'd done, was to present a credible spending plan at the same time as the tax cuts that we announced.
You had a go, it didn't work out for whatever reason, and that analysis will go on for some years to come. We have Jeremy Hunt there as Chancellor now, hinting quite strongly now there won't be any tax cuts, but the truth of it is, under 14 years of Conservatives, for a variety of reasons, the tax burden has risen to the highest since the Attlee government way back in
80 years,
1951, whatever it is.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. Good afternoon to you. It's Ben Leo here on GB News Sunday. Forgot my name then. You're with us on TV, online and on digital radio. Lots of you have been sending emails in. One particularly caught my eye from Bob, who says, we have a democracy, but it's more dangerous to go out after dark and sometimes in the day than places like Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry our democracy gives us a very poor way of life. Interesting point. Anthony says, plainly, the wealthy Tory party, this is on the allowing foreign dentists to come and work, unqualified, potentially. He says, plainly, the wealthy Tory party are going to foist these untested, possibly unqualified foreign dentists on the poor who use NHS dentistry while they use qualified professionals privately for themselves. This stinks of elitism. Now, should the government be prioritising British workers? According to the Office of National Statistics, a total of 6.9 million people born overseas were working in the UK at the end of last year. Now, that's up by more than 400,000 over the past year alone. And now, ministers are planning to scrap exams required to allow those dentists from countries outside of Europe to work here. Let's see what my panel make of this now. Joe Phillips, Claire Purcell, forgot your names as well. I think I need a couple of coffees in here. This is, I mean, what could go wrong with this dentist situation? Allowing foreign, potentially unqualified dentists to come and sort your molars out and whatnot. What could go wrong, Claire?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody wants somebody that's only partly qualified roaming around inside their mouth and looking at their teeth. But I think what's more worrying is that the government are putting this scheme up to address the lack of NHS dentistry availability, but they're not putting any restrictions on these people who could come over. They're not saying you have to come and work in NHS dental practices. So you've got the potential that these people could come over and actually just set up a private practice in the UK, so you're not solving any problems anyway. So it's only half a plan. So I think they really need to go back to the drawing board and have a look at this. You need qualified people. You also need people to only work in NHS dentistry. That is where the need is. We don't need any more private dentists. We have lots of them.
But why wouldn't you go private, Joe? I am lucky enough to go private. When I go for a checkup, it's 90 quid. If I had some braces a couple of years ago, that was £5,000. I mean, why wouldn't you go private when dentists are earning so much money compared to the NHS?
What do you mean, why wouldn't you if you're a dentist?
Why wouldn't you work in a private capacity, yeah?
Oh, no, absolutely. But, I mean, this isn't a problem that's arisen overnight. How long have the Conservatives been in power? Just remind me. 14 years. You know, how many dentists could have been trained in that time? People have been warning about this for years and years and years. And we know that dental oral health is linked to a whole load of other things. It's not just about, you know, whether your teeth are nice and straight and shiny. It's linked to diabetes, it's linked to dementia, it's linked to all sorts of things.
Some heart conditions as well.
Heart conditions, all sorts of things. Checkups, you know, there was a lot of sort of sneery stuff when Labour suggested having supervised teeth brushing at schools. But actually, it makes sense.
I was all for that.
I think
everyone was saying
really
it was a nanny state, but
you've got young children, Ben, and anybody knows, you know, actually it's quite a good idea to have somebody to check that you've done it, that you're not painting on the mirror with the toothbrush.
I brush my kids' teeth, and I'm quite on that. But I thought it was quite a good idea because the amount of times that you see kids coming in with, you know, absolutely rotten teeth, they come into school or nursery having crisps for breakfast. But Joe, let me ask you this one quick question: nobody from your side of the argument ever links dental waiting lists or even NHS waiting lists with migration. We've had record levels of legal migration. We've got a so-called invasion of the southern border. There's just too many people here, isn't there?
I really resent that phrase, invasion of a southern border. We've just been talking about Ukraine, for goodness sake. We are not...
Well, that's how people describe it.
Well, I certainly wouldn't, and I would reject that, and I think you should too. I don't think it's a very helpful or sensible phrase to use. So what are you trying to say? That
there's too many people here.
There are too many people who are jumping the queue, or too many people who can't afford...
Just too many people here. We've got net migration of 700,000 a year, a city the size of Birmingham, which is the Conservatives' fault.
Are working here, and they're working here, they're filling gaps.
Are they all working here? We had
You've just read out the figures.
6.9 million, but, Jo, we had latest GDP figures on Friday, 0.3% contraction. We're now in a recession, but the important one was GDP per capita, per head, how wealthy individuals are. That contracted by 0.7%, despite a city the size of Birmingham coming here every 2 years. That completely blows apart the myth that immigration is good for the economy.
But, who would do these jobs? Because we've got 9 million people who are economically inactive, and many of those people are long-term sick. Now, a lot of that sickness can be traced back to COVID. A lot of it can also be traced back to things like bad housing. A lot of it might be linked to dental treatment, waiting lists, ability to get to see a doctor. That's got nothing to do with immigration. That's about the failure of this government to deal with public services and the infrastructure.
Claire, someone argue the fact that some areas have to wait 4 weeks to see a GP. They would blame that on migration, and also, not just solely, but also the fact that the Tories, arguably, in some quarters, haven't been funding the NHS and dentistry enough. I mean, I'd say the NHS has enjoyed record funding, but this link to migration is never discussed enough, and whenever it is discussed, it seems to be sacrilege among people from the left.
I think you have to separate the argument between the legal migration and those who are here in an irregular fashion, because they are very, very different things. If you look at net migration stats, those are people who are coming into the country, like 200,000 Ukrainians, people from Hong Kong, and the Afghan relocation scheme, just to name those three. Those will have jobs to look forward to, they will integrate into the system, and the majority of them are students, so they're here to put into the economy. If you look at the other side of the market, there's a massive issue with people coming here on an irregular basis. It is incumbent upon the government to actually sort that out and process people quicker, because there may be some people that you can send back whence they came, but there may be some people who will become economically active, because all of those who are sitting in asylum hotels at the moment can't work. So they can't put into the economy. Some of them may be able to. Some of them we don't want to stay here for many, many reasons. So there is an awful lot to sort out. It's far too complicated.
What do you make of these
GDP
per head figures contracting 0.7%, which, in my opinion, completely blows apart the myth that migration is good for the economy?
Yeah, but we've also got a lot of people who are economically inactive for very, very many different reasons. Now, that could well be because of the strikes in the NHS, that you've had operations that have been delayed, people are waiting, so they can't actually go into work because they're waiting for treatment. So that needs to be sorted out. But, I mean, there are always arguments. You look at the pressures. I think the NHS has had more money than it really needs to have thrown at it. I think it needs to be organised better, and I think you need to take the management layers
You're not allowed
out.
to say that. That's against the holy Bible of the NHS.
Well, I've said it, and people can come and hate me for it, but I really think you need to look at the organisation and look at the management and look at diversity officers and things like that, which are a massive waste of money.
150k a year, those diversity officers.
There you go.
And
But also
what are they good for?
Look at IT, look
really
at
briefly.
digitality. You know, there's an awful lot of other stuff that could be done to make it more efficient.
Yeah. OK. Jo Phillips, Claire Purcell, thank you very much. Lots more coming up on today's show, including it's been reported that the former presenter Philip Schofield paid his ex-lover a six-figure sum in a non-disclosure agreement, preventing them both from discussing their relationship. Of course, this was the massive story last year. It was probably the showbiz story of the year. We're going to get stuck into that with our showbiz reporter fairly shortly. All of that and more to come. I'm Ben Leo. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show. Sunday mornings from 9:30.
We had Grant Shapps on last week. He was talking about how defence spending is now creeping up to 2.25% of GDP. Ben Wallace's predecessor suggested it should be 3%. We hear that we've got the smallest army, I think, since the Napoleonic Wars. Numbers are down. There's a question as to whether we can staff frigates in the Red Sea. Why haven't we sent aircraft carriers? What's your impression of the situation?
Well, I don't think it matters how much you spend, it's how effectively you spend it. And we spend it very ineffectively. We have lots of scandals about defence spending. And I think partly because of the monopoly position of some of our defence suppliers, we don't get good value and we don't get reliability. This latest story in the Telegraph is that HMS Diamond, which is our ship, which is out there defending the Red Sea, doesn't have the capability of firing a missile from the ship to the land, so it can't participate in the attacks on the Houthis. So in order that we can participate in the attacks, we're flying RAF aircraft from Cyprus, which is a very long way away. When I was Defence Secretary, I ordered cruise missiles for our nuclear-powered, but not nuclear-armed submarines. And I think we have 6 or possibly 7 of those. But last autumn, it was reported that 5 of those were out of commission, were not available. We have about 21 aggressive surface ships. So we've got 2 aircraft carriers, then we've got frigates, and we've got destroyers. But at any one time, you can count on about half of those not being available because they're under refit or whatever. So we have a minimal surface fleet now. And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem that we're able to deploy a submarine to the area that can fire cruise missiles. Our 2 aircraft carriers, built at enormous expense, are sitting in Portsmouth.
Which seems to most people ludicrous,
well,
at least with what's going on.
It doesn't seem ludicrous to me.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo, on your TV, online and on digital radio. Now, it's been reported this morning that the former This Morning presenter, Philip Schofield, paid his ex-lover a 6-figure sum in a non-disclosure deal. According to the report, both Schofield and his former colleague signed the NDA, preventing either party from ever talking about their relationship. Joining me now is showbiz reporter Stephanie Tecci. Good afternoon, Stephanie. This was a surprise story from the Mail on Sunday, wasn't it? We enjoyed, and I did enjoy it last year, the drama of the Schofield situation. Now we know that he's gagged his lover post all that commotion. What's going on?
I'm not surprised about that at all, Ben. As you know, the Philip Schofield scandal with his affair with his younger male colleague was probably one of the worst kept secrets in showbiz for a very long time, which the papers had sat on for many years, and obviously they waited till Philip was ready to come public with it. But there's always 2 sides to this story, and you know, there's very much more detail which hasn't been made public. And in these kind of situations, yet we've heard Philip's side of the story last year when he gave that interview to the BBC, but this poor young man, there's much more that the media and journalists themselves, I can imagine, have been proposing him with many figures of money for him to tell his side of the story. And to be honest, Philip Schofield, with this move, it's damage control, because to be honest, the dust has kind of settled. It's been almost a year now. Philip's come out of the limelight and he's kind of put this situation to bed by paying off his lover. But as well, if you think about this young man whose identity I won't go into, is probably well known within the industry and within the papers. And this man is probably finding it difficult to continue maybe a career in the media industry. So to be honest, this is not just about keeping him quiet about the affair, but it's also for him to have a living, because as you can imagine, his identity is well known online and all these kind of places. So for him, he needs to now set a life again, minus post a scandal. And also, Ben, with Philip Schofield, you know, he hasn't legally done anything wrong with this affair. And so potentially there could be room for Philip Schofield one day in the future to pick up his broadcasting career.
Really?
And the last thing, maybe.
Who would have him?
You never know. Someone out there might still want him, or maybe 5 years from now, when the dust is really settled, he can pick up his career again, and he wouldn't want any more of this information to get out there.
Well, look, you never know. I mean, bizarre things have happened. Donald Trump became president, didn't he? So you never know. Yeah. And you make a great point about the young lad. On one side of the argument, I'm thinking, you know, he shouldn't be censored and muzzled like this. But on the flip side, apparently, according to the Mail on Sunday, he's got a six-figure payout for the privilege. So hopefully he can rebuild his life like that. As for Philip Schofield, where's he been? You said that he's made a reappearance recently. I've not seen that. Where's he been?
Well, you know, he's been out, you know, he's still got a lot of celebrity friends. So, you know, he's of interest to the paparazzi. So there's been many meetups that I've seen him. He's met up with someone like Vanessa Feltz. So he's been here, there, everywhere, you know, and the pictures that I've seen of Philip in the newspapers, he still looks like he's in good spirits, but you never know. A picture can only tell so much. But, you know, this was once the face of morning TV. So he's definitely taken a tumble from grace. And, you know, recently, he sold the apartment, which apparently was where they were meeting up and conducting this affair. So I can imagine Philip is very desperate to put the chapter to bed.
Well, yeah, certainly a fall from grace. And one particular quote from that Mail on Sunday story this morning says, Philip Schofield has lost a lot, but imagine if the full details came out, it would be pretty cataclysmic for him. Stephanie Tetchy, thanks very much for that. We did reach out to ITV for a comment. They're yet to respond. So, yeah, we just have to take the Mail on Sunday at their word. You've been watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Ben Leo. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Don't go anywhere, though. Nana Aquir is up next. But first, let's take a look at the weather with Marco.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, I'm Marco Patagna. Here's your latest weather update from the Met Office. We hold on to unsettled weather across the UK over the next few days, all seeing some rain at times, but staying mild for the time being at least. This weather front's pushed outbreaks of rain away from the southeast of England during the course of the afternoon, so we've got a ridge of high pressure building in from the west, quietening things down for the overnight period, but further rains gathering out towards the west, and that will move in across the far northwest of the UK as we head into the overnight period. Elsewhere though, showers will tend to ease through the evening. We'll see lots of clear weather, turning quite misty though, with some fog patches across parts of Wales and the southwest of England during the early hours. Following on from that rain band, we'll see showers turning quite blustery there towards the far northwest by the morning. Quite a mild night, temperatures down to 4 or 5 degrees across rural parts of Scotland, but elsewhere holding up in the high single figures. As for Monday, well, outbreaks of rain continue their journey southeastwards across England and Wales, weakening all the while, so giving some patchy rain across the far southeast into the afternoon. Elsewhere, it's a day of sunshine with a few showers around, those showers quite blustery towards the north and west of Scotland. But once again, it's a mild day for the time of year. Temperatures mostly in double figures, 9 or 10 degrees at best in the north, up to 13 or 14 Celsius down towards the southeast. As for Tuesday, well, further wet and windy weather will move in across the northwest of the UK. Towards the south and east, though, it's a quieter picture, a bit breezy, but plenty of sunshine around and staying quite mild for the time of year. Outbreaks of rain move their way southeastwards later on Tuesday, and it then stays quite unsettled on Wednesday and Thursday, but turning colder towards the north later.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock Monday to Thursday on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.